Hi everyone. Yeah, like Matt said, it's pretty rare for me to be here, which is really lovely. It's nice to see so many familiar faces. I work for GitHub, previously worked for Microsoft. I'm in developer relations, and I like background music too. So I am going to talk to you a bit about GitHub Copilot, but also kind of more the history and the future of what these AI dev tools are trying to do, or at least what we're trying to do with those. So let's get a little bit of level set. Who here currently uses GitHub Copilot? Okay, that's probably about 30% of the room. Who here uses other AI dev tools, so like Cursor or just ChatGPT or yep, okay, most people use something. Does anyone here vehemently disagree with using any kind of AI dev tools? Yep, Suze, of course. So what I want to do, and I understand some of those concerns, what I want to do, I want to talk about kind of where it came from to start off with, and then talk about, I'm going to do a bunch of demos because that's always fun, I think, to do demos of what it can currently do and what we've been adding to it. But then I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing with it and what we think the future of kind of AI-supported software development might look like in the future. So GitHub Copilot came from a team inside GitHub called GitHub Next. And it's kind of their R&D department, or our R&D department. If you think of like an automobile manufacturer, they have their R&D departments which look at like a self-driving. I think I lost my mic. There we go. All of that kind of stuff as well. So things like the airbag came out of an R&D department at automobile manufacturers, cruise control, all of that kind of stuff came out of those departments. And generally they operate a bit like a team that is allowed to do a bunch of experiments and see what works and what doesn't. So in this team, every 6 months or so, when they had a meeting, and every 6 months or so somebody would bring up the idea of like a general purpose AI-based software development tool that could just do general stuff. And every time that came up, it was just kind of abandoned as, well, the tech's not there. It just can't do a good enough job. And then suddenly, GPT-3 happened. So OpenAI got to this GPT. They did GPT, GPT-2, and GPT-3. And they gave the API to this GitHub Next team and to some researchers at Microsoft just to try it out. And so they worked out a couple of experiments and ways of testing whether it could do this. And they started by giving it these self-contained programming problems. Like, hey, can you write some code to do this? And GPT-3 was this borderline point where suddenly, like out of the box, without giving it any specific instructions, it was solving about half of the problems successfully, like correctly. These are self-contained problems, right? But just giving the straight problem, about 50% of the time, it would produce runnable code that would solve that problem. They started tweaking the way they were asking the questions and the context they were giving it, and really soon they were getting it up to about 90% of these self-contained problems that it was solving correctly. And that's the point where they were like, this could actually be a useful tool. So they experimented quite a bit with this. Now that form of testing where they give it like small self-contained problems, they don't do that anymore. And basically because it got too good at those kinds of questions. And also that's not super realistic. Like in your day-to-day job, you don't often have these like self-contained, how do I write the code to do this specific thing? You're working with a bigger purpose, trying to produce value and trying to implement a feature that somebody wants, right? So that's not a reliable test of how useful these tools are going to be. Initially, the thought was they would just add a chatbot, right? And so, sorry, I meant to do that. This was back in June 2020. So this predates ChatGPT by about a year or so. They initially thought, yeah, chatbot would be good. You just have this tool there and you ask a programming question, ask it to give you code, and then you grab that code, you copy and paste it into the editor. But then somebody in that team came up with the idea of, well, we use like IntelliSense or autocomplete. Why don't we just see if we can get it to do that? And when they started implementing it that way, they realized that that was a way better paradigm, and they completely dropped the chat for quite a while and just used it as like an autocomplete. feed it the context from the file you're looking at, maybe some context from elsewhere, and get it to give you what we now call ghost text. So here's the suggestion of what you want, or hit tab if you want to accept it. So this was way back in June 2020. Since then, we've done a lot. So this is kind of a really vague timeline. Don't worry, you don't have to read all of this. But we spent about a year in a technical preview, so a year before we decided we were going to release it properly. And so even though they were experimenting in June 2020, in about a year they did a technical preview. And then a year after that, they were like, this seems like it's ready for general availability. So if you look at these tools, and this is happening a lot, you look at these AI tools and you're like, they've all sprung out of nowhere. Like they're just throwing a chatbot at whatever. Right? There's about 2 years of research and trials and things before they actually brought this into a generally available state. Since then, they've released different SKUs. They've released extensions for VS Code, and JetBrains stuff. And then lately, we've started experimenting with extending this idea as well. So we've got Copilot Chat. So we brought the chatbot back. Copilot Workspace, which is trying to kind of work from an idea or a task, edit multiple files at the same time to solve that problem, and then let you iterate on that. Extensions so that you can now use the Copilot interface to talk to your third-party services, and I can show you that as well. So you don't ever have to really leave your editor, which is always handy. And then really recently at our GitHub Universe event, we announced things like model choice, so you can now choose what large language model you want to use, and Copilot edits, which also is editing multiple places in your code base to try and solve a problem as well. And there's a bunch of other things we're experimenting with too, some of which I will show you at the end because they're kind of cool. They're still very much experiments and fun and interesting, but So I want to take a little step back as well and talk about why we're doing this. And I apologize right now for those of you like me who are very cynical about this kind of stuff, because I am too. The point of doing this, I heard some snorts. The point of doing this is developer happiness, right? And I know what some of you are probably thinking. That sounds like a wonderful marketing line. And it is. So I'll admit, when I heard this was the selling point, developer happiness is the point of doing this, I was very cynical. It turns out, though, that developer happiness is very strongly correlated with developer productivity and therefore with a company's bottom line. So there's a bunch of research out there from people like Dr. Nicole Forsgren, Gene Kim, and a bunch of other people. I think Gene was here last year as well, that show that the happier your dev team is with their day-to-day jobs, the more money your company makes, or the more they reach their own company goals. So improving developer happiness is an important thing. And I want to take a slight detour here to kind of talk about that. Typically, we measure in the business land, we measure developer productivity by basically mapping how much it costs us to have a human resource and then how much output we get from that person, right? And this is a pretty terrible way to measure productivity or how the organization works. Traditionally, you just measure these outputs against inputs, like how much does it cost us, how much money do they make, right? And in development, that often boils down to things like lines of code or number of commits or pull requests and things like that. So terrible metrics that are incredibly easy to game. And they don't represent value. They represent lines of code, like these raw statistics. Some of the most valuable stuff that happens in dev teams is not anything that produces code. And in fact, some of the most valuable changes I've made to code bases are deleting code, right? Especially my own code. That's usually a source of value. So if this traditional method of measuring productivity is terrible, then what's a good way to measure productivity? Now, some of you may have heard of the SPACE framework. It basically measures a number of dimensions associated with productivity, especially in software development. It comes out of Microsoft research. Again, Dr. Nicole Forsgren was leading that part of research. And I'm not going to go into it in too much detail. I would strongly recommend having a look at this. It's fascinating. It gives you a great idea about how you can measure how well your own development teams are working as well. But ultimately, in short, if you're trying to measure and track productivity across your dev team, you can get a better measure of how productivity is changing, especially over time, in your team by choosing metrics from several of these different areas. So for example, you might choose commits as a measure of activity, and also satisfaction. So ask your developers, did they have a good day today? Right? More on that in a sec. Or how long it takes for you to merge a change and get it into production as a measure of efficiency and flow. And if you measure several of these and then map them over time, you get a better idea of how productive your teams are. Now, some of these categories probably resonate with you as developers in terms of happiness as well, particularly if you think about your day-to-day jobs. But I want to look at the first one especially because it's obviously very closely attached to developer happiness, right? So satisfaction, you can think about basically just how fulfilled you feel in your job. Your team, with your team, with the tools you're using, with the culture, with the processes. And that well-being is about how healthy and happy you and the rest of your team are and how your work affects that. So it's a little bit broader than just, am I writing code efficiently? It's more, am I happy with the stuff I'm doing? And why should a company care if you're satisfied and happy as long as you're producing stuff that gives them money? Well, there was another piece of research that came out of our GitHub Next team back in 2021, called the Good Day Project. It's a project led by a researcher called Arini, and it mapped self-reports from developers about whether they had a good day to GitHub activity. So things like commits and pull requests and stuff like that. And the findings were fascinating. It wasn't just GitHub activity, but it was other stuff that happened as well. It looked at their calendars and their meetings and things like that. The findings were fascinating, and I love some of them. Some of them are horrifying. I want to highlight two that I found really interesting. One key finding was that developers need deep focus time. Now, we've all heard about flow, getting into a flow state so you're concentrating on what you're doing and not getting interrupted, both to be productive but also to feel productive, right, and to feel happy with your job. So there was an interesting measure of the likelihood that a developer will make progress towards their goals and how that might depend on how much focus time they get. And you can quantify this when you think about meetings. So it turns out, this is in the study, if you have one meeting a day, progress towards your goals, about 99% of people thought that they've made meaningful progress towards their goals. Anyone want to guess how much that goes down for 2 meetings? No? All right, I'm just going to do this one. 74%, so it's still not too bad, right? 2 meetings in a day. Any guesses for 3 meetings in a day? 14% of people said they made meaningful progress towards their goals, right? So it's really about being able to focus on the work you're doing. And if you have 3 meetings in a day, you can't do that, right? So this is interesting. Have a look at that research if you want to show it to your manager. The other one that I liked, the other thing that they were able to quantify in this survey was whether you felt like you had a good day, which was kind of the point of this survey, versus the number of interruptions you had. So if you had minimal or none, so they kind of grouped this, minimal or no interruptions that day, about 82% of the time you said, I had a good day. Guesses for interruptions the majority of the day? Yeah, 7%. So the effects of it are real. Like there are real effects to being interrupted and not having that flow state as well. Now, the summary of all this really is that if you are happier, if you don't have these interruptions, you get to get into this flow state, you can do your work, you don't have to keep context switching to something else, then you are happier, but productivity goes up as well. So this is an actual benefit to the organization if you can do this. But once again, it's hard to quantify that, right? So I'm going to give you one more exercise that you can show your manager. Does anybody want to guess if you have tools and processes that save you 5 minutes every hour, right? Which is not actually a lot. 5 minutes every hour in an organization with 100 developers. Anyone want to guess what that means in terms of money? like actual Australian dollars? No? Nobody wants to guess this. It's about that. It's almost $1 million a year. And that's purely savings on, based on salary. This is not the real the real impact of having happier developers who are more likely to want to do the work, right? So why am I talking about this in the context of Copilot and those things, and AI dev tooling? Well, the point of tools like Copilot, but also the point of things like syntax highlighting and autocomplete. So when you hit the dot on an object in an object-oriented language, you get the functions and the properties and things of that. It saves you time. You don't have to keep going out to the internet to look stuff up. That's the point of these tools, right? Or if you want to just have if you have a question about, what does this library do, for example, being able to just ask that question directly in a chat window saves you a little bit of time, right? And yes, all the usual caveats about making sure that what it's giving you is actually correct, which is a significant problem, they all apply. But the point of this is to keep you in that flow and to get you more productive without the interruptions so you can keep doing your work. All right. I've talked enough. Speaking of money, I think I've earned mine by doing the marketing stuff. So we can move on to fun things, which I still need HDMI for. Sorry, I just dropped that. All right. Let's open code. How's the Zoom level, by the way? We good? People in the back? All right. So there were a lot of people who said they had used GitHub Copilot before. And so you're probably most familiar with it if you do something like, okay, there we go. Straight away, it's given me a suggestion of what it thinks I want to do, which is not correct, so I can just keep typing. Function to test, I don't know, the function, cool. I don't know, for an Australian phone number, I don't know. Oops. And then that's your test, right? So yeah, it's also done regex, which is more than 5 minutes an hour, trust me. But you can also, an area code. So, oops. Live coding, there you go. So, there you go. It's got one of those, I think. I can't read regex, so let's do this. I'm going to highlight that, and I'm going to use inline Copilot. So this is the chat, and I'm just going to say explain. And it will hopefully explain what that regex does. I'm just going to wait until it spins that up and say view it in chat, because that's a little bit easier to read. And it's broken down the regex. And now, admittedly, it's breaking down the regular expression that it wrote. So I'm really kind of just trusting it in two respects here. But it breaks it down. You can also do something like, by the way, these are my little tips. Sorry, not Azure. Explain, no, sorry, explain for workspace. Like I'm 5 in a short paragraph, please. Which sounds funny, but I do this all the time. Wow, that's a smart 5-year-old. Yeah, all right, well, maybe not the best example for 5-year-olds, but at least it's cut it down to a short paragraph, right? So this is kind of a combination of it'll help me write the code with the autocomplete, or what we call ghost text, what I like to call OG Copilot, but also the chat, so you can have conversations about, is there a better way to do this? And it says, yeah, you can improve the readability, which is probably correct, I guess. Yeah, so it's a little bit more readable. Now, there's a bunch of other things that we've added to this. So you can do, you can ask it for documentation. You can ask it to write some tests around that. So you say tests, and it will generate some tests. Let me just close this window. There you go. And it says we recommend installing Jest, and I can click on that, and it should do it for me. And then this is in a new file. So if I accepted that, it should add it to another file and things like that. So it gets you a long way there with kind of doing that work. All right, cool. One thing that we added fairly recently was a bunch of features to kind of make it a bit, how do I close this? Make it a bit easier to, don't save, make it a bit easier to kind of navigate existing code bases. So this is an issue, especially if you're getting up to speed with a new project, or if you are ideally trying to contribute to an open source project. If you can ask questions about that code base and get reasonable answers that can help you kind of navigate, that can be really handy. So in this case, this is a React application. I'm not much of a React person at all. So let's just see if this will run, actually. I probably should have done that before. No. So npm run dev. Let's see if that works. No. Use 20. Is that right? npm run dev. Gotta love live demos. Okay, good. All right, localhost, good. Everything's working absolutely perfectly. Localhost 3000. So this is the application. This is like a travel application that we built called Copilot Airways. Real production code for sure. And in our profile page, we've got this like, sorry, it's just loading. I think we've got this like recent points activity. Yeah, some people know what that is. That's Cassidy Williams, by the way, also known as Cassidoo. Yeah, anyway. So we've got this table of like points activity, but it'd be good if there was a graph underneath it. But if I don't know this code base at all, I'm not really going to be able to find this graph, or it's going to take me some time to like go through the application. So what I'm going to do is just open chat, kill that, open chat, and then say where in this code base is the profile page. Now, what this is doing is a couple of things. So first, it's saying, well, you're looking at the entire code base, so we need to look at this entire workspace. And this is a what's called a participant in the application, and this is using a thing called intent detection. It's saying, well, I think I know what kind of thing you're asking, and you're going to need to look across the entire code base to do that, and the workspace participant knows about your code base. We've indexed all of the code, we know what files do what, and so we can say rerun the question without it, but it's detected that we probably want this. It's pulled in a bunch of references, and it's given me a really succinct answer about it's on page.tsx. If I open that up, yeah, this is our app profile page tsx file, right? So we've kind of been able to navigate that. I could ask questions like, you know, are there tests for this file? And it would understand the file that I'm looking at, try and find somewhere where there's tests appropriate to that file. I can do things like say, do I have tests for all of the functions in this file? And it will say, you know, no, it looks like you've only got tests for these functions. Here's a test for the missing ones if you wanted to start there. So again, I'm completely in control of this. I'm not just handing over the reins and expecting it to do the work. But it's helped me out a little bit. Now, if I'm going to add that graph, sorry, I'm jumping all over the place. If I'm going to add that graph, let's just do this. If I'm going to add that graph, I want to be able to make it like this consistent thing across the application. So there's probably rules or other examples of graphs in the application itself. So I might ask something like that. Is there anywhere else in this project where I'm drawing a line graph? And it will say, yeah, well, there you go. You're drawing a line graph in on-time line chart. So this is a, yeah, cool. This looks like a React component, I think. I did say I don't know anything about React, so I'm just going to assume it is. So if I wanted to add like that profile line chart, I wanted to kind of look like this one. So I want to use that as a reference to say it should look like this. But actually I don't know, an area chart for like growing the thing is probably better. So I'm going to ask for an area chart. If I have a look at that profile page again, profile, no, it was page.tsx and profile. I can see that I'm pulling information from this points activity service. And again, I could explore this stuff by asking the questions, but I'm just going to save some time. So I want to maybe create another reusable component like the on-time line chart. I want to edit the profile page. I probably want to write some tests. I might even want to change the README. And I could do all of that in Copilot kind of one file at a time, but instead I'm going to use this, which is a new feature called Copilot Edits. And this kind of attacks a bunch of pages at the same time. So I'm going to see if I can remember what my prompt is. And I'm going to say, can you create a reusable area chart to show points activity? It should look like, and then I can hit hash, and it will let me choose either things from a knowledge base or from the web or from the code base or other things like that, or individual files. So that was on-time line chart. And now we're referencing that as a piece of information so it knows, oh, okay, I need to look at this as reference. Right? So again, we're kind of trying to ground it in existing code and existing behavior. So we get fewer hallucinations, I guess. It should look like that and appear below the table on the profile page. Now that profile page, because we've got it open now, it's already in this working set, like it's already being referenced. So we don't need to explicitly do that. Make sure you add tests. What else? Oh yeah, pull the data from the points activity service, which is what we're pulling all of this one from as well. All right, that looks pretty good. I'm going to show you one more thing just before I hit go, and that's another thing that we added recently where you can choose which model it uses. So GPT-4o is the standard one, but you can also use O1 Mini if you wanted to, or O1 Preview, which is a bit slower. They have a thing in them kind of around chain of thought behavior. So it's abusing the word think, but it thinks through the like the implementation. It says, what do we need to do for this? And then it uses its own logic, I guess, to work through it. But also Gemini and Claude. So I'm actually going to use Claude for this, just because why not? And so you can see, I'm just going to zoom out slightly. You can see that it's saying, right, well, it's going to create a new points activity chart component using that activity. It's going to add it to the profile page. It's going to add tests for that component. And as it's going, you should be able to see over on the page here, it's generating these edits and making those changes kind of in real time. So you can see it writing the code, basically. And then because it's GitHub, we like showing the diff and the changes, lines changed and things like that. So we can skip through these. So page has changed, points activity chart tests is there, and there's this points activity chart one as well. Or, actually it's changed a bunch of things. So I'm just going to use this little tool to show me all of those changes in one go. And here's the chart. Here is the profile page. Here's the tests. Okay, so it's ended up changing 3 files. I'm going to save all those files, click OK. Remember how I said this is a live demo? So let's just switch over. There you go. So we've got this interactive live thing. Now, this is following the style of the rest of the application, and it's using the same components and the same libraries and things like that, because I referenced one that we'd already done elsewhere in the application. Now, I wouldn't recommend just blindly accepting what it gave you. I would actually look through that code, but I'm on stage and I don't have time. So yeah, so that works. So we've changed a bunch of files all together. We did it by grounding it in the truth of, here are the files that I care about, and here's what we need to change. One thing, if you're paying a lot of attention, by the way, is if you have a look over here, let's just close this window, you might see there's this launch darkly service that it's using. Now this is obviously not a standard way of writing a React component to include a feature flag. For those of you unaware, Launch Darkly is a feature flag service and set of libraries and things like that. Edith Huber, I think, is speaking later on at YOW as well. She's one of the co-founders, I believe, of Launch Darkly. Really, really good. You should go and watch her. She's amazing. So I'm using this in my application. Now, I didn't specifically ask Copilot to use Launch Darkly in my question, in my prompt. It could have copied it from the on-time line chart, but what it actually did is used another feature called Copilot instructions. Now, this is something we actually have been asked for a lot. Can we always tell Copilot to do something the way that we want to do it? So you can now add this Copilot instructions markdown file and tell it things that you want it to include every single time you ask a question. So in this case, I'm saying, when you make a new reusable React component, add a launch darkly feature flag and give it some code to try, to go from as well. There's also another thing which I put in there for demo purposes, saying use client, because that broke me a couple of times. And add tests and things like that as well, which I explicitly asked for, but it's in there too. Now this is useful for a project, because we've got these Copilot instructions in the project. So if there's something specific for the project, you can add it to the Copilot instructions in that repository and it will apply for everyone. If it's something that's personal to you, you can actually have Copilot settings, Copilot instructions in your own user settings for Visual Studio Code. So if I always want it to respond like I'm 5, I can ask for that, and it will always do that, but just for me. I just want to show you this as well, though. Always respond to questions like a pirate. Because you obviously want really useful behavior like this. What does this file do? Scroll down. Oh, I'm in edits. Sorry, let me stop that. Need to go back to chat. What does this file do? This is obviously something you would definitely use. Yeah. So that's the most practical example I could come up with for that. It doesn't. If I'm doing this overseas, I make it speak like an Australian. It's horrible. It's just so. G'day, mate. Cheers. This looks. Yeah. Anyway. So yeah. So this is a few different surfaces that we have for Copilot. I have hours of demos on this, but also so does the internet. So feel free to look at the internet. It's a great source of truth and other things. But I want to talk about a couple of other things before I finish. And mainly I want to talk about the direction that all of this is heading. So there's some legitimate concerns, I guess, in the industry that a lot of this stuff is replacing developers or likely to replace developers. The general talking point that we always get told and always put out there is that it's not replacing developers, it's a tool for developers to become more productive, right? And I think that's true. Even from a purely cynical point of view, GitHub makes their money from developers, right? If we were to get rid of most of the developers, I don't earn money anymore, right? I can't feed myself. So even if you're incredibly cynical about this stuff, we don't want to reduce the number of developers. We want to kind of improve the lives of developers so they're happier, so they can use more GitHub services and pay us more money, right? So if you get extremely cynical about all of this, just keep that in mind. The other thing is, I have not met a single dev team that is not just buried under things that they would love to do if they had the time. Is anybody, because I want to find somebody who puts their hand up to this, is anybody kind of bored during the day because there's not enough stuff on their backlog? Yeah, cool. I'm still at 0 hands for that question, so that's good to know. So where's all this heading then? We're not replacing developers. That's not our intention. We're trying to make their lives easier. So what's next is the question. The easiest way to find out what stuff we're experimenting with is to go to the GitHub Next homepage. This is the R&D department, remember? And there's a bunch of things in there. This is a recent screenshot. Those top two are fascinating. There's a learning sandbox, which you can kind of see. You click into these and you can read what they're experimenting with. But the learning sandbox is this amazing thing that works some of the time, where you can say something like, I'm a C# developer, intermediate skill. I want to learn about React. And it will add a bunch of suggestions of libraries, and you can say, I do want you to include this in the information, or I don't, and this is my skill level. And then you tell it to go, and it will build a lesson plan to teach you from the point of view, from your current position as a C# developer, learning React with a live working sandbox of the code that it's trying to teach you. And I've seen this work incredibly well. It's nuts. It doesn't always work though, which is why it's an experiment and why they're trying to work out whether this is something that people might want to use. And if you scroll down a bit, you can see a bunch of projects that they have tried and they're like, that actually doesn't work, or it's not good enough to actually be a product, but they're continually experimenting. GitHub Spark, I want to show you right at the end if I've got time, but it's a fascinating one as well. What this is kind of heading towards, and this sounds a bit gimmicky as well, is that we're trying to move the AI from just like an autocomplete tool or a chatbot to a bit more of a thought partner. That sounds like a marketing term because it probably is. But right now it can help you write code, help you understand your code base a little bit more. But we're kind of moving from this purely generative tool to one that helps you navigate the code base and understand the code base. And we're kind of continually moving towards that direction. So a tool that can kind of help with discovery and understanding, but also with ideas and ideation and things like that. So as an example, and this is a bit pie in the sky, but imagine you have like an AI coworker, right? And they've been working it's like somebody who's been working in the code base for decades, right? They have infinitely good memory because they have memorized the entire code base, and immediate recall. They don't have to go and look things up. And also, most importantly, they want you to succeed because they are trying to help you, unlike the dude who microwaves fish in the break room, that guy, right? So that is somebody who is actually trying to help you with your job. They know everything about the code base, and they can respond really quickly, right? So we're getting close to this. Imagine, for example, being able to turn to your new friendly AI and say something like, all right, I need to add a new payment method to the payment screen on our application, right? That AI tool can pull all of the relevant parts of the relevant files that get used to do all of the payment page stuff. And it will show you what probably needs to change in what parts of those files to add a new payment method. You can go even further and say it might suggest, well, you probably need to change the FAQ on the site as well to add this new payment method. And even further, it could say something like, well, what is this payment method? You can give it a name, and it can go and look up the implementation details and start to pull some code together to implement that as well. And then you tell it it's crypto, and it deletes your project. But the idea is like it's kind of working with you to solve this goal and not working in single lines of code or single functions. It's kind of pulling the information towards you and the relevant parts of the code that you're going to need to change and making suggestions. So this idea of this kind of two-way communication between the person and the tool that you're using is kind of what they're heading towards. Again, kind of early days. They're getting close to some of this, but it's not a given how that's going to work. Really what we're talking about kind of is AI native development. At least that's what they're trying to call it. Right now, the AI dev tools are really visible. Like you saw, I was opening up a chat window. I was like pausing so it could autocomplete. And that's because they're stuck in that paradigm of we've got our file tree on one side and our code on the other side, and it's up to me to find those files and change the right lines of code. But if it can surface the stuff you need it to surface, the parts of the files, and even describe what those files are doing or those bits of code are doing and how they link together on the other side, ideally, you could even get to this idea of what they call a bicameral user experience. So you have your natural language on one side and the formal syntax on the other side across a bunch of files, and you can change either of them. And if you change the specification of what should happen, the code changes to match what should happen on the other side. Again, this is a stretch goal, right? They are experimenting with stuff. This is not something we can do right now, but that's kind of where they're heading, or where they're trying to head. So really what we're doing is just abstracting that code a little bit further. By the way, GitHub is not far from the only like organization who is trying to do this. There are a ton of different tools out there that some do it incredibly well, some do it not quite as well. But this kind of requires a change to the way we think about implementing a feature. Right? One last thing as well. I think I've got about 5 minutes left. I want to talk really briefly about another direction that this is heading. I've said before as well that we don't want to get rid of developers, and in fact, kind of the opposite is true. GitHub has recently made a public statement that they want to get to 1 billion developers. So currently there are 100 million, slightly more than 100 million developers using GitHub, or 100 million active user accounts, I believe. And we've said that in the next few years we want to get to 1 billion. Now, we can't get to 1 billion developers by just training new people to be developers. You kind of have to get to that by redefining what a developer is, which is a great way of, you just change the goalposts and then you can meet it. But one way that we're doing this was a thing that we announced at GitHub Universe called GitHub Spark. This is almost like a consumer-focused tool, and it's kind of expanding that idea of, it's yet another iteration in the low-code / no-code area, right? Some of you will remember Silverlight and whatever was before that and whatever was before that one as well, where we keep reinventing this. This is kind of the latest iteration of this that's using generative AI to kind of help out. I think the easiest way to show you this is actually to show you. So this is GitHub Spark. Let me zoom in a bit. And if I wanted to do something like, was anybody in Suze's talk last one? Yeah, a few people. All right, for those who don't know, she was using ants to generate randomness for entropy or something. But how'd I go? That's not bad. Perfect, great. So I could do something like create an app to track the number of ants in my colony. And of course, sorry, slide. Kill that. There we go. It looks exactly the same as the slide, so I wasn't faking. Create a number of ants in my colony and when they were born, for example. I don't know. That's a legitimate question, isn't it? And so the way that they're working with this is they're kind of making the assumption that the UI itself can be relatively consistent, and there's some standard things that happen as part of an application. There's some data storage that happens. There's some theming that's going to happen. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of things that, as a low-code, no-code developer, you don't really care about. And also, the problem with this as well is it's super early, and so it's probably not going to work. That'd be great. Is it still going? All right, I knew that would happen. All right, let's go and see one that I've already done. Good. Let's try Spark staging. Ooh. Because I want to show you this. Yeah, I'll sign in. This is one of the problems with using something that's like super not public and technical preview, is that sometimes they ship stuff while you're watching. And I think I know what the issue could be, because we're relying on a lot of Azure stuff in the background. And that could cause a problem right at the moment. Let's just try one more time. All right. Do we want to try there? How long have I got? Like 30 seconds. Create an app to track the ants in my colony and when, that's all right, were born. I'm going to try this one more time. Yeah, I know. It is a coolony. They're really amazing, these ants. Wearing sunglasses and leather coats or something. This is me padding for time while it thinks. Let's hope staging works. If not, I can just tell you what the amazing stuff you would be able to see would be. It's just not working for me. Cool. All right, so I'm not going to put this on camera, but there's a reason that some of the Azure resources behind the scenes are not working for me. Come and see me another time, and I can show you that demo. The idea, though, is that we've kind of restricted the UI and everything into using React, using standard components, using standard themes, but also things like storing data. You don't have to worry about what database you're using underneath. It just uses a key value store. You can also do things like, hey, when I add a new ant, can you generate a name for it? And it uses a call to Azure OpenAI to use a large language model to pull back a name. So you can use AI inside your own applications to do that as well. So the idea is generally that somebody can describe what they want, iterate on it a number of times, and come up with something that is kind of useful. People on the GitHub Next team have used it to track their kids' pocket money. There's a really simple tic-tac-toe game that worked with one hit. There's a whole bunch of stuff. You can even use webcams. We did one where you can use the webcam to scan your badge, and it will read the QR code and do that. And again, no code. Like, I'm not touching code at all. So this is how we get to 1 billion developers. And this is how we kind of start to try and use the AI tooling to solve some of these problems, make people's lives easier, and raise that floor of who can be a developer and what they can do. Anyway, that was the last thing I wanted to show you. Let's quickly, please make sure you leave feedback, not just for this session, but for other sessions as well. I will be sticking around here for a little bit later. And otherwise, thank you so much.
Thank you.